Hey everyone, thanks for checking out part 2 of our 3DS retrospective. Today we're covering the years 2013 to 2014. If you saw our first video, we went through all of the great and notable games of the 3DS's first 2 years. So today we're going to dive right in with 2013. First up is Fire Emblem Awakening. This game has a really interesting history. Originally, it was kind of designed to be the last Fire Emblem game. The series was on a bit of a decline. People just weren't interested in Fire Emblem anymore. In the West, it never really picked up. We had a couple titles, but we missed a lot of the early stuff. So I think, the first ones we got were the Game Boy Advanced ones and the GameCube one. And by that point, I think the series was already on a decline. So this one came out. They expected it to be the last one, so they included elements from many of the previous Fire Emblem games. They made this story take place about 2,000 years after the original Fire Emblem and Fire Emblem Gaiden, which both never came out over here. And they added a bunch of new stuff they thought people would like to make the game try and fit a bit more in a modern context. And it was a huge seller. It did really well. So that's why we saw a bit of a rebirth of the series. There's a bunch of new games. There's a mobile game. There's tons of amiibos for it. It really breathed new life into the series and got a whole new generation of players interested in Fire Emblem. So, a huge success. In the game, you control a character who has amnesia. You can customize that character, and he's taken in by Crom and, ends up fighting in a war between two nations. It's an interesting story, and like I said, it's a great rebirth of the series, so it's worth checking out if you only got into Fire Emblem more recently with Fates or, the mobile game. Next up is a game I no longer have, that I know is going to upset some of my friends, which is Etrian Odyssey 4. The Etrian Odyssey series is a cool series, but also it is balls hard. It's a real hardcore first-person dungeon crawling RPG. This was the first one on the 3DS. All the mainstays of the series are there. First-person battles, building your own party, the mapping stuff that people love from the first 3 games. It's just a good follow-up to the other titles that were released on the DS. There's some new classes in it, and also they introduced an overworld. So now, instead of just, going down into dungeons, you can also fly your airship around this overworld in between dungeons. So it's a nice addition to help build out that game world. Right after that, a game that I pretty much just own for its pedigree. Castlevania Lords of Shadow Mirror of Fate. This portable game followed the original Lords of Shadow, which came out on PS3 and Xbox 360, which itself was a rebirth of the Castlevania series, which is one of my favorite series. It was supposed to be designed kind of like an original 2D Castlevania, so it's 2.5D, all the backgrounds and models are in 3D, but it was supposed to play like a traditional side-scrolling Castlevania or like a Symphony of the Night Metroidvania style game. Unfortunately, it just doesn't control that well. How quick and responsive the controls of the original Castlevanias were really are what make that series, and this is just it's just a little too heavy, I guess you'd call it. It also kind of marks the downfall of the new Castlevania series after just one title. Lords of Shadow was super well received. This game was, not really considered great, and then Lords of Shadow 2 is considered pretty bad by most people. So really, it's just kind of notable for being part of the Castlevania series, but not one you need to go out and check out. Next up, one of my absolutely favorite 3DS games, Luigi's Mansion Dark Moon. The original Luigi's Mansion takes a lot of flack. I don't know why. I think it's an incredible game. It's maybe one of my favorite games in the Mario series. And Dark Moon does everything but better. Instead of having one huge mansion to go around now, there's 5 little mansions. There's an online and local co-op mode that's really fun. And it's just a wicked game. Like, if you haven't played Luigi's Mansion, it's a really cool, atmospheric game where you play Luigi, you go into a haunted house, you have this vacuum cleaner that sucks up ghosts, so you go around the house capturing ghosts and looking for treasure, and it's just really fun. I highly recommend you check it out if you've never played a Luigi's Mansion game before. And let's hope it's not the last in the series, too. Right after that, Pokemon Mystery Dungeon. Which one is this? Gates to Infinity. Pokemon Mystery Dungeon is the Mystery Dungeon series isn't known too well over here, but in Japan it's huge. It's a roguelike series, so it's a dungeon crawling game where when you die you lose a lot of what you've built up and collected. But people find that really fun. Those games are really interesting. And in Japan, the Mystery Dungeon series is one that they just throw different franchises to. So, you can get your Dragon Quest Mystery Dungeon or your Chocobo Mystery Dungeon, and now Pokemon Mystery Dungeon. There's, a couple like Sharon the Wanderer, which is a mystery dungeon game that a lot of people consider to be great. This is considered the 9th game in the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series, but it's actually the 4th game if you don't count the different versions of each game, right? Just like Pokemon Red and Blue, there's different versions of the first couple entries in the series. This one focuses on a new region of Pokemon. It uses 3D models now instead of sprites, and it uses the AR capabilities of the 3DS to unlock new dungeons. So you use your 3DS to find things that are circle-shaped, and that opens a portal to new dungeons, which is an interesting mechanic, but a bit, not necessary. Next up is Shin Megami Tensei Devil Summoner Soul Hackers. This is one of the first games, if not the first game, that Atlas started putting out in these, cardboard boxes with the soundtrack. The Devil Summoner series was an interesting spin-off of the main Shin Megami Tensei series. This one has a bigger focus on technology, which is part of what made the original series interesting, and it's actually a part of the Saturn game, which never came out over here. So the Devil Summoner series started on Saturn, and there were 2 entries there, as well as a couple spin-off discs. And this is the second game, so we still have never seen the first original Devil Summoner, but this is a pretty good way to experience the second one if, we'll take a week and get fans of this series. It does play a bit old school because it is just a direct port. If you played this and then played Shin Megami Tensei 4 right after, this is a much smoother experience. But like I said, it's just great to have this out over here. The next game I want to mention is Lego City Undercover, The Chase Begins, which is not a great game, but it's pretty notable in its own right because it is kind of a prequel to the first big Wii U exclusive. So Lego City Undercover was a big Wii U exclusive. It's your Lego style game, but now it's an open world and built on an original story. And this was just a prequel that you could play for your 3DS in the same style. Right after that is the port of the Wii game Donkey Kong Country Returns 3D. If you didn't play the Wii version, it's a great follow-up to Donkey Kong Country. It's a really good game, a fun platformer. And this one adds a new world with several new levels and a new mode that gives you items to make the game a little easier and more balanced for the 3DS. Next up is Animal Crossing New Leaf. I would consider this a bit of a revitalization of the Animal Crossing series over here anyway. I don't have hard numbers or anything. I just remember when this game came out, everyone was playing it. Everyone was talking about it. People hadn't really been interested in Animal Crossing since the original GameCube game. And this one kind of brought a lot of people back into it. It's an interesting game that still pretty much stays true to the original formula. You move to this new town and you kind of become mistaken as its mayor. So the new mechanic as mayor is that you can make a couple decisions which change up the gameplay a little bit, but not too much. This time they don't even give you a house to start in. You have to live in a tent until you get your house, and then it becomes your traditional save up your money, build up your house. There's a lot more customization options for your house, for your avatar. You can swim now. You can go out to an island where you can play different mini games, and you can visit other people's towns online. Next up, following suit from Atlas, Capcom puts out a little bit of a special edition for Project X Zone. So same cardboard sleeve, soundtrack. This one comes with an art book and also this poster. Project X Zone is a tactics RPG by Capcom. It's the sequel to Namco X Capcom, which came out on the PS2 in Japan, but never came out over here. The story involves, you play these new characters who meet up with all these characters from different gaming series. You get into a bunch of different tactics-style battles with monsters and villains. The game's interesting because your units are made up of 2 different characters, so they attack in teams, and when you get into a fight with one of your units, then you can control when each character attacks, and you can kind of build up these combos, which make it really fun. So instead of just being Capcom and Namco characters, this game, now that the merger has happened, it's got Bandai Namco, Capcom, and Sega. So there's a bunch of characters from all of those companies, a bunch of really cool and obscure characters. There's over 90 characters in the game, so there's a ton of stuff there for fans of all of those companies. Next up is Shin Megami Tensei 4, so our first big special edition for this year. It comes with a huge strategy and art book. Persona was doing really well at this point, but only the most hardcore JRPG fans were into Shin Megami Tensei, so I think it's interesting that they threw out this big strategy guide inside the special edition to help gamers who may have a bit of a hard time with the series because it's notoriously a really difficult series, and while Persona is at least manageable, Shin Megami Tensei itself doesn't give you quite as easy a time as Persona does. The game setting is a little bit different from your traditional Shin Megami Tensei settings. It starts off in this like ancient Japanese kingdom. Your main character is training to be a samurai. And they have these gauntlets, which are, you know, basically computers, which fits for the theme of the series, but really is out of place in the setting. But it soon gets to a more traditional Shin Megami Tensei setting, and you can see how it fits in with the rest of the series. If you haven't played a Shin Megami Tensei before, it's basically a turn-based RPG. All the battles are in the first-person perspective, and you collect and use demons to fight for you. If you're into JRPGs and haven't checked out the series and you don't mind a bit of a challenge, I would say it's definitely one of the best experiences you can have. Special Edition also comes with a soundtrack. There's 8 tracks on here. Next up is Mario & Luigi's Dream Team. If you haven't played the Mario & Luigi series before, I highly recommend it. It's some of the best writing in the Mario franchise. It's hilarious. During battles, you control Mario and Luigi, and each of them control with a different button. And pressing those buttons at the right time can help you dodge enemy attacks and increase the power of your own attacks. There's some really interesting combat in it. The goal of this one is to save these little creatures that have been trapped in stone, and to do so, Mario can enter the dream world through Luigi's dreams and free them from there. In the dream world, there's some really interesting mechanics where you can play with Luigi while he's asleep, and that changes things in the dream world to help Mario progress. Graphically, a big change to the game is now all the backgrounds are in 3D, but the characters are still 2D sprites. Next up is Hakuoki, Memories of the Shinsengumi. This special edition comes with a bunch of stuff. There is a art book here. There's a fan. And I don't know, some kind of cloth? What is this? Japanese style towel. And of course, the game itself. This is an interesting franchise. It's an otome game, which was really becoming popular at the time, but mostly on the PSP and Vita. We got quite a few of those games on the PSP. The original Hakuoki was released on the PSP, and this is an update of that. It's basically the same game, but it's got 6 new mini-stories. And I think you say it otome. That's a subgenre of dating sims. So you would think that dating sims would be a little more popular over here, but we've never really had released. But otome games picked up, and they are a dating sim from the female perspective. So you play a girl character. The emphasis is usually more on the story and less on the dating in these games. So in this one, it takes place in like feudal Japan. This girl has come to Kyoto to look for her father who's disappeared, and he was involved in creating this medicine that turns people into berserkers. And it's just a really crazy story. And the Hakuoki series has picked up quite a bit of popularity. The game was released, there was an updated PS3 version of the game as well. There's an anime that goes for like 2 seasons and a couple OVAs and some movies. I think it may be the most popular otome game that came out over here, so it's definitely worth noting for that. Next up is Etrian Odyssey Untold the Millennium Girl. I also don't have this anymore. I just don't have the time for these series. These games are like 80 hours long each. But this is one that I did put quite a bit of time into. It's really interesting because it takes that original dungeon crawling formula of the other Etrian Odyssey games, and it's a remake of the original Etrian Odyssey for DS. But they also include a actual story mode. So, the other games have a story, but it's kind of figure it out on your own. This one, it gives you a pre-generated party with real characters and tells a real story as you go through it with cutscenes and voice acting. And it's a good way to get people into the series that maybe want a bit more story involvement. Next, we get to Rune Factory 4. Following the first 3 Rune Factories, which came out for 3DS and the 2 Wii games. Rune Factory is a spin-off of the Harvest Moon series, but it's more of an RPG. It still has all your traditional farming and relationship building that Harvest Moon has, but now there's also an emphasis on dungeon crawling and fighting monsters. This one seems to be copying Animal Crossing a little bit, because in the story you get thrown from your airship and you end up with amnesia, but the town that you end up in think that you're some kind of royalty, and just like Animal Crossing, they let you make some decisions that affect the gameplay. The game has some streamlined farming mechanics to help make that part a little easier, and they also put a big emphasis on family. So just like the other games, you can have a family, but in this one you can also go out and go adventuring with your family, which is interesting. Next up is Pokemon X and Y, which was a pretty big thing for the series. The Pokemon series has had minor enhancements with each version, and X and Y was the first time that they actually updated it a little bit more than usual. The big change is just the overall graphical style. So instead of being sprites now, everything is 3D models. I think in maybe Black and White they updated the Pokemon themselves in battle to be 3D models, but now everything is. It's used to great effect, but not to change the gameplay too much. So there are certain times and places where you're moving through the game and they use the camera to show the Pokemon world in a way that's never been seen before. It works really well, even though the one big town can be really confusing to move around in. But for the most part, it looks great, and it's still, the camera still is placed in a way that makes it look like the original Pokemon games. So for the most part, it's still a top-down RPG. So at the time, it was a big deal, and it really helped define the graphical style of all the Pokemon games that came afterwards. Other than that, there's a couple minor enhancements, the same things you'd expect from every new Pokemon generation. Next up, I want to talk a bit about Skylanders Swap Force. If you watch the other video, you'll know I talked a bit about those games just because they're always different from the console versions. And if you're spending, the money to buy figures, you kind of want to get the most out of them, and since the main games are only like 20 hours long, it's really good to have another thing to use those figures on, and that couldn't be more true with Swap Force, because in Swap Force the big thing was you had these 16 swappable characters where you could swap their tops and bottoms, and you could make up to 256 unique character combinations from that. So if you're someone who really liked the series and spent the money on those figures, it's cool to have different ways to use those figures. You're not going to get to put any time into all 256 combinations if you bought all those figures and were just playing the main game. Right after that is Hometown Story, which is really interesting because it's a spin-off of the Harvest Moon series. I think it's the only one in the Hometown Story series. And it's actually a spin-off of the Story of Seasons series. So, I went into that in the last episode with the last Harvest Moon game. Go back and watch that if you want to know what's going on with the Harvest Moon series. But basically, this is a Harvest Moon game that doesn't have farming. There's way more of an aspect on running a shop. So you run a shop inside this town, and you still have all the relationship building that you have in the traditional Harvest Moon series, but the gameplay is just a little bit different. There's way more of an emphasis on building relationships with people. There's over 100 NPCs in the game, so it's quite a bit bigger than a traditional Harvest Moon town. If you're a big fan of Harvest Moon, it's worth checking out. Next up is Legend of Zelda: A Link Between Worlds. One of my favorite Zelda games ever. A Link to the Past is my favorite Zelda game, and this does such a good job following up on that. They do some really interesting things. They use the 3D to great effect where you can see down on multi-level dungeons. The new ability in the game is that Link can go against certain walls and turn into this wall painting and then move along the walls as a flat character, which helps him access some areas he couldn't usually get to. The game uses an item rental mechanic, so you can rent items so that you can complete the dungeons in any order, and eventually you can get those items permanently. But it's just a really cool take on the series. I don't think any Zelda game, even Ocarina of Time, has really captured the feeling of the Link to the Past overworld, so I'm really glad to see that they decided to go back to it and put out something just like that. The last game for 2013 I want to talk about is Mario Party Island Tour. It's the third Mario Party game for a portable system. There's 7 boards and 80 different mini games in it. There's 4-player local download play, so that makes it a little easier to play with your friends. Although, the big draw of the Mario Party thing is all being in the same room and playing together, and I think that's an experience best suited to consoles. The first big game for 2014 is Bravely Default, which comes... There was a special edition released through the Square Enix online store, which I picked up, which is pretty limited. It's got a soundtrack, a deck of cards, the game itself, and an art book. And it comes in this big, nice box. Bravely Default is actually the kind of spiritual successor to the DS game Final Fantasy IV Heroes of Light, which itself was an attempt to make a Final Fantasy game that played closer to the original, so not get bogged down in all the crazy modern-day Final Fantasy stuff, but instead just be your traditional turn-based RPG. It's actually the enhanced version of the game, so in Japan Bravely Default came out, and then they had an updated version called Bravely Default for the sequel, and that's the version we got over here, so it's got all the new extra content from that version. There's a mechanic in the game where you can kind of build up your attacks, so you can hold off on having an attack to build power, and then unleash it all after building up 2 or 3 times. It's got a classic job system, so there's a ton of jobs that you can switch between and learn. It's interesting, there's a lot of cool stuff about the game, it's really fun. I recommend you check it out if you like traditional RPGs. Speaking of traditional RPGs, One Piece Romantic Dawn. Probably not something that most people need to check out. We have it because Michelle is a huge One Piece fan, and all of the One Piece games are really rare. This one's no exception. This game, there was a low print run, and it's just really hard to come across. I think it's the only One Piece traditional RPG that was released in English. It's got all the major characters from the manga. It covers quite a bit of the show. I think it goes up to like episode 490, which is way past what I've seen. But, for a One Piece fan, it's really nice to have something that covers that much, and to have a traditional RPG is a great way to experience it. Next up is Professor Layton and the Azorean Legacy. This is the 6th game in the Professor Layton series. It's the last game of the prequel trilogy, and Level 5 said it would be the last game to star Professor Layton as the main character. Which is true, because now they announced Lady Layton to be the next game, and they've revealed that that's going to be his daughter in that one. So if you haven't played any of the Professor Layton games, they're these puzzle adventure games. They tell fun stories through, cool cutscenes, but for the most part, you're just solving these brain teaser puzzles. This one has more puzzles than any of the previous games, so I think it's over 550 puzzles, which is insane, because that's part of the reason I haven't gotten to this one yet, is I'm still working on number 5, and there's a lot in this one. Next up is Yoshi's New Island, which is the 3rd game in the Yoshi's Island series, which originally started with the amazing SNES platformer. Gameplay is pretty much the same as what you would expect. There's new underwater levels, there's these 2 power-ups including huge eggs and metal eggs. Yoshi can transform into 6 different vehicles, and those are controlled with the motion controls in the system, so it's an interesting new way to use those. Next up is Kirby's Triple Deluxe, which is another traditional Kirby platformer, although it's called Triple Deluxe because there's 2 extra kind of games in there. So you've got your traditional Kirby platformer where Kirby, this beanstalk carries him up to this new world where King Dedede has been captured by a new bad guy, and Kirby has to save him. And there's an unlockable mode there where you can play as King Dedede through the game again, and there's different bosses. So that's a nice kind of way to play through it twice. The first of the other 2 modes is Kirby Fighters, which is a Super Smash Bros. Inspired fighting game that's all Kirby themed. All the characters are different Kirbys. All of the stages are Kirby based, so that's really interesting. And the other new mode is Dedede's Drum Dash, which is a rhythm game that uses all songs from the Kirby series. So it's a nice package. There's a lot in there for Kirby fans. The next game I want to talk about is Mario Golf World Tour. It's just the next game in the Mario Golf series. There's a new Castle Club mode, which is kind of like a career mode where you build up your Mii character. There's a mix of real and Super Mario style golf courses, and it features online tournaments. Right after that, one of my favorite crossovers, Professor Layton versus Phoenix Wright. Phoenix Wright is one of my favorite series, so I love this crossover. The game really feels like both of those franchises, so you'll play one chapter in Professor Layton style with Professor Layton exploring different places, and then you'll play another chapter in Phoenix Wright style with Phoenix Wright, defending people in trials. It's just a cool, fun little crossover. The characters are really interesting. The story is really interesting. I just said that last Professor Layton game was the last game to star Professor Layton, and that still holds true because this thing was out in Japan way before it came out over here. It was announced back when the 3DS was first coming out, and I'm just happy we got it eventually because it's a fun game, and it's great for fans of both of those franchises. Next up is Theorism Final Fantasy, another special edition. So the special edition comes with the 3DS carry case, the original game package, so the cardboard sleeve that comes with the game, and a little remix selection soundtrack. It comes with a more fleshed out soundtrack, and the collector's box, and also these collectible cards. The second pack of cards we got at one of the Distant World concerts. I've never seen any more collectible cards anywhere else, so I don't know how, where you got those. Again, if you played the original Final Fantasy Theatrhythm, Curtain Call adds 220 new songs. It adds games that weren't in the original, so a lot of the spin-offs, stuff like Final Fantasy X2 and Lightning Returns and Final Fantasy 13-2, Crystal Chronicles games. It covers a lot of those games. I think the one game it doesn't cover is Dirge of Cerberus, and that's because I think that was all licensed music. From some J-pop band. And other than that, it's pretty much the same as the original rhythm game. So, you build your party, you level them up by completing different songs, and there's new melody quests that let you unlock characters. So, overall, if you like Final Fantasy, I think it's a must-play. If you don't like Final Fantasy, then obviously you can avoid this one. Alright, next up is another game I got rid of, but definitely an important game, which is Super Smash Bros. 4. This game fixed all the problems I think people had with Brawl. It came out for the 3DS a couple months before it came out for the Wii U. The controls were tighter. It just felt like a better game overall. There were 50 characters. I think 17 of those were new. You know, they had Lucina and Robin from Fire Emblem. They had the Wii Fit Trainer. They had the Animal Crossing Villager. They had Shulk from Xenoblade. Rosalina and Bowser Jr. from the Mario series. Just a Little Mac from Punch-Out. Like, just a ton of new characters. A bunch of great fun characters. There was a Smash Brothers Amiibo line that launched right after this, which was supposed to release every character from the roster in Amiibo form, and they did get to that. There's only 3 DLC characters they haven't released in Amiibo form. And Club Nintendo had a cool promotion at the time where if you bought both the Wii U version and the 3DS version, you would get a cool little soundtrack that had remix tracks from all the stages. It was a nice bonus. And DLC that did eventually come out for the game, you could pay a little extra to have it on both versions. So overall, it was a great Smash Brothers game, maybe the best. Overall, I prefer the Wii U version because it's easier to play with friends and it's just a better experience. But the 3DS version is still a great way to play the game too. So the next game worth mentioning is Skylanders Trap Team. Just like the other ones, this is a different game from the console version. The big deal with Trap Team was now you got traps that you could trap the monsters in and then you could use their abilities. The funny thing is the traps that you have to buy for the console game, you don't need them for this one. So you can just trap the monsters in the game and the traps have nothing to do with it. Yeah, so it's just funny they went that route. But again, if you're a Skylanders fan and you were buying those figures, this is a cool way to use them. Next game is Fantasy Life, which was developed by Level 5 and published by Nintendo, and it was kind of Level 5's take on a Animal Crossing Harvest Moon style of game. You could switch between 12 different jobs, so you could do things like you could be a woodcutter or a miner or fisher, carpenter, cook, hunter, magician. Like there was tons of different jobs and you'd level each one up, and that would give you different abilities to use to complete quests and objectives. And you could also go out of town into different areas and fight monsters to complete objectives there too. So overall, if you're a fan of those slow life games, this one's a bit more action-packed. It is more like Rune Factory than the other ones. But it's probably worth checking out if you're into that genre. Speaking of Harvest Moon The Lost Valley, the first game in the new Harvest Moon series by Natsume. The first one in a long time not to be developed by Marvelous. This one was developed by Talbot Inc. and it was never released in Japan, so it was an exclusive North America game. This one has a big focus on customization, so you could customize your house a lot more than before. You can expand your house, you could move around some of the buildings in town, and you could also alter the terrain a little bit, so that was kind of the focus this time. Next up is Pokemon Alpha Sapphire or Omega Ruby. These are remakes of the Game Boy Advance games, Ruby and Sapphire. We didn't get an Emerald, which was the director's cut of those, which is a shame. So they're updates, but they're complete remakes. They're based on the Pokemon X and Y engine. There's a ton of new features. There's a bunch of new stuff in there. So if you're a Pokemon fan, you probably checked it out. Again, it's just worth mentioning because it's another big Pokemon release. The last 2014 game in my collection, and the reason I felt comfortable getting rid of some of my Etrian Odyssey games, is Persona Q Shadow of the Labyrinth. I'm a huge Persona fan. I love Shin Megami Tensei. I love the Persona series. This is a game that was developed by the people who made Etrian Odyssey. It is an Etrian Odyssey style game starring the cast of both Persona 3 and 4. So the premise is that, the casts of Persona 3 and 4, they both meet up through time in this school festival, and all of the booths represent different dungeons. And just like Etrian Odyssey, it's first-person dungeon crawling. You create your own map as you go through it, but it's real fun to see the Persona characters in that setting. Just like Etrian Odyssey, it's really hard, so you're going to be spending a lot of time with this one. Both series are known for their difficulty, but when you put those two together, it's something special. The special edition for this came with, what do we get? I have a Teddy in here, but I don't think that came with this one. That came with a PS3 game. This one came with an art book. Just a little art book that shows all the characters in the game and their new chibi styles. There's a soundtrack that's got 4 songs from the game. There is the game itself. And there was a pack of the cards which represent the social links in the series. You got the second pack, the second half of the cards with the fighting game that came out for PS3 and 360, so you kind of needed to buy both to get the full set. And actually, it's not in the box because it's actually holding my 3DS right now, but it came with a carrying case for the 3DS. And the last game worth mentioning for 2014 is the Ultimate NES Remix Pack. So those were made popular on Wii U. There were 2 download games that they remixed different NES games, so there were little challenges. They kind of taught you how to play the games a little and then gave you challenges for a whole bunch of different NES games. The pack came out on Wii U as well, but the thing that makes the 3DS pack interesting is that it also features the Famicom version, so you can play the Famicom remix games on the 3DS version. And that does it for 2013-2014. I think there may be 2 more videos for this series. I'll do the next 2 years in the next video, and then I'll probably wait a bit before I do the 2017 video. I'll probably wait until the 3DS is completely dead and no games are coming out for that to do the last year. Let me know if I missed anything up to before 2015, because there's a ton of games to go through for this system, and I just picked the ones that I know about and I think are notable. Thanks for checking us out. Like and subscribe if you can. Share if you can. These videos are really picking up steam, and I do appreciate all the support I've been getting for this stuff. Thanks a lot. I'll see you next time.